be talking about fair use in the context of orphan works. And so that is, for those who may not be familiar with that phrase, that label, orphan works are things that are eligible for copyright protection. So books, photos, music, etc., not provably done with their copyright. So not something that's so old or so clearly follows certain rules so clearly that we can be sure it's in the public domain. We can't be sure it's in the public domain. It might have a rights holder, but we can't find the rights holder. We can't figure out who owns it. Someone might, but they're unidentifiable. And that's so it might have a parent, it might have an owner, but we can't figure out who that is. That's why they're called orphans. Examples of how this sort of thing shows up in our collections, and by our here, I'm talking primarily academic libraries, but sometimes other libraries, especially in archival collections. Things in our collections might be orphans because there's no identifiable creator. So tons of different things in our archival collections. You're like, I don't know who made this. A really clear common example would be like snapshot photographs. They show up in a collection. Sometimes you know who is in the photograph, but you don't know enough about who took it to be sure where the copyright might have started. Other things in our collections would, maybe we have an identifiable author. We do know who made it. And we might even know things like, they died in such and such a year. And they had a nephew and a niece who would have been their heirs, who would have inherited any rights that they had. But we can't find the heirs now. Another way things might show up as orphans in especially archival collections is output from like an organization or a company that was operational like 25, 30, 40 years ago, but it's sort of ceased operations, and it ceased operations in ways where we don't have a lot of information about what happened to the rights afterwards. Sometimes you can actually be clear, an organization ceased operation and we know where the rights went. Sometimes the rights sort of trail off into the atmosphere. They're possibly there, but nobody knows who they belong to. When we think about orphan works, I hope it's obvious to a lot of people that things in our collections that are orphans may be, and this is a little bit of an odd way of phrasing it, but there may be an unusually high representation of otherwise marginalized or underrepresented groups of people in orphan materials. And if you think about that sort of just basic and just basically logically, who is a little bit more likely to have a little bit less clear access to formal means of registration or formal recording of them as the creator of an item? Who is a little bit less likely to have public records that are fully correctly documented? If our collections, and I'm thinking here, for example, of the University of Minnesota libraries where I work, we have a transgender history collection. And in that collection, people are represented under the name they lived by. That is their name. But the legal records of that person may not be under those names. And so sometimes, and that's not at all the only situation in which somebody might have less clear documentation because they are a member of a more marginalized groups. Immigrant groups often face things like this, or just even people with whose names have changed due to marriage or remarriage. The records are a little bit less likely to be clear for various reasons for people in marginalized groups, and even for things like organizations like companies or especially advocacy organizations, because resources tend to be more limited. Those are perhaps a little bit less likely to survive long enough for us to be sure what happened. So orphan works are a place we may want to look in archival collections if we're trying to increase representation of populations and people and groups that we have overlooked a lot in the past. Don't worry, I have more thoughts here. It may be. So orphan works. There is no official law in the US about orphan works. I often encounter people in libraries who think there are some rules that we can follow, and if we follow these rules, these orphan works are free for us to use. That's not true. There was legislation proposed and it didn't pass. Some other countries do have orphan works rules. They're very burdensome. I've tried to use them once recently in the UK. It's very confusing. And honestly, I'm not worried that we don't have rules about orphan works because fair use is particularly well suited to things like digitizing orphan works. And it's actually for, fair use is not usually clear. Fair use is not totally clear with orphan works, but there is one really clear reason why orphan works are a little bit more likely to be available for fair use. And that is, if we cannot figure out who the rights holder is, there is very little likelihood that there is an ongoing commercial market for that work. If there were a commercial market, we'd be able to figure out who the rights holder is. And the fourth factor of fair use is, are you harming the market for the original work? When we cannot find the rights holder, it is very unlikely that we could be causing harm to the market for the original work if we use it out of our collections. Additionally, for libraries, for digitization projects especially, we are usually educational users. We are usually nonprofit users. Sometimes we even have a transformative purpose. Those all go to the first factor of fair use. There's 4 factors. We've got 2 of those factors. For most orphans, the first factor and the fourth factor will tend to weigh in favor of fair use for lots of library uses. So fair use can be really great to think about providing access to orphan works in our collections. A lot of libraries are still, we've been moving away from some of our more risk-averse practices, but a lot of libraries are still a little bit leery of relying on fair use. Thankfully, more and more people are relying on it. And orphan works are an area where if your library is interested in thinking about fair use, this is one of the less gray areas of fair use in a lot of ways. And as I said before, this can be an area where we can be looking to increase representation of otherwise marginalized groups. For example, the University of Minnesota Libraries, we are not the only place that did this, but there was a large set of grants a few years ago for hidden collections. And what the University of Minnesota Libraries did, and I worked with a number of really cool people on this project, was to look across our archival collections, not following the traditional archival practice of sort of keeping our collections together, looking inside of collections for representation of African American history. And among other things, there are lots and lots of examples we found like this. We found things like worker advocacy organizations within larger national social advocacy organizations. So we have a social welfare history archive at the University of Minnesota. We have records from the YMCA. We have lots of records from places like settlement house organizations or advocacy organizations like the Junior League. And in various places in our records, we found groups within those organizations, often of African-American workers in those organizations, or sometimes African-American people in those organizations partnering with outside communities, talking to the national organization. In that case, it's pretty clear this group is not the national organization. The national organization can't give us permission to digitize those materials because they probably are not the copyright owner. But the people who were in the group, there isn't really a record of that we can track down. In some cases, we could actually identify some people and we went and talked to them. But in other cases, we were having to make some guesses about, should we digitize this? We don't know who owns the rights. It would be almost impossible to figure that out. The records themselves don't give us the information needed to figure out who the rights holders would be. We think fair use probably covers this. So fair use is a great tool for digitizing and providing access to orphans. And in particular, that is a place where you can look to increase representation. We can look to increase representation of otherwise marginalized communities. But big, huge pause. A lot of the reasons that orphan works may be places where otherwise underrepresented or marginalized communities are represented in our collections, and our here, I'm speaking very specifically of primarily white institutions, places like land-grant institutions, like the one I work at. All of the reasons I mentioned before why people might be more likely to be represented in orphan works are themselves reflections of injustices, but also sometimes the people who gave us the collections and or our own institutions were directly involved in taking things away from marginalized groups. their representation in our collections, and I'm saying they and us, we certainly contain people who are members of marginalized groups, but this is something where it's important to think about who has voices and where. When marginalized groups appear more often in orphans in our collections, sometimes it's because we took rights away from people. Sometimes it's because we took things away from people. We may be complicit in their having been orphaned. And there, I think, I'm not saying we shouldn't digitize those. I am saying the legal issue is not the issue there. We can, but we need to partner. And I don't mean just partner, we need to be in relationship with communities to get guidance on whether we should. We need to be ready to hear no. We need to be ready to hear conflicting opinions because communities are not monoliths. And we may need to be ready. I think this is part of a conversation that goes to things like repatriation and sharing resources with other organizations. So fair use is a great tool for providing access to lots of our orphan materials in our collections. It can be a tool for increasing representation of otherwise marginalized groups. However, it's something we should be very, very careful about. And it's something where sometimes we are not the people who are the experts here, and we are not necessarily the people who should be making the decisions. That is my talk about fair use here. Thank you.